The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then suddenly the world became too much. 13-year-old Chloe Mitchell stood at the Family Feud podium, her hands pressed tightly against her ears, as the studio lights blazed down like interrogation lamps, and the sound of 300 people applauding crashed over her like a tidal wave. What had started as an exciting family adventure had transformed into a sensory nightmare that was threatening to overwhelm every carefully constructed coping mechanism she had spent years developing. Standing beside her, Chloe's twin sister Zoe immediately recognized the warning signs. The way Chloe's breathing had become rapid and shallow, the way she had started rocking slightly back and forth, the way her eyes had gone wide with the kind of panic that came not from fear but from a nervous system that was being bombarded with more input than it could process. Zoe had seen this before many times, and she knew exactly what was about to happen. "She needs quiet," Zoe said urgently to Steve Harvey, who was approaching the podium with his usual smile and energy, unaware that one of his contestants was on the verge of a complete sensory meltdown. "She needs the lights dimmed. She needs it to be quiet." Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for over a decade, and he had learned to read people quickly. But this was something new, something he had never encountered on his stage before. He looked at Chloe, who was now making small, distressed sounds and whose hands were pressed so tightly against her ears that her knuckles had gone white, then back at Zoe, whose face was filled with the kind of protective urgency that only comes from someone who truly understands what another person needs. The Mitchell twins had come to Family Feud with their parents, aunt, and uncle, representing a family that had learned to navigate the world with one foot in neurotypical society and one foot in the unique landscape of autism spectrum disorder. Chloe had been diagnosed with autism when she was 5 years old, after years of her parents trying to understand why their bright, loving daughter seemed to experience the world so differently than her twin sister. The diagnosis had come after a long journey of doctor visits, evaluations, and concerns that had started when Chloe was just a toddler. She would cover her ears during birthday parties, would have emotional meltdowns in grocery stores under fluorescent lights, would refuse to wear certain textures of clothing that felt unbearable against her skin. What initially seemed like typical childhood sensitivity had gradually revealed itself as something more complex and profound. The Mitchell family had spent years learning about autism spectrum disorder, attending therapy sessions, working with occupational therapists, and most importantly, learning to see the world through Chloe's eyes. They had discovered that autism wasn't a deficit to be fixed, but a different neurological wiring that came with both unique challenges and remarkable gifts. Autism had never been a limitation for Chloe, just a different way of processing reality. She was brilliant at mathematics, could memorize entire books after reading them once, and had an artistic talent that left adults speechless. Her ability to notice patterns that others missed was extraordinary. She could detect inconsistencies in music, spot details in visual art that escaped trained observers, and understand complex mathematical concepts with an intuitive grasp that amazed her teachers. But she also had sensory processing differences that meant certain environments could become overwhelming very quickly. Loud noises felt like physical pain. Bright lights could trigger headaches and anxiety. Crowded spaces created a cacophony of sensory input that her nervous system struggled to filter and organize. Touch had to be predictable and controlled. Unexpected changes in routine could create anxiety that lasted for days. Zoe had appointed herself as Chloe's interpreter and protector from the moment they could walk. She had learned to read her sister's signals, to anticipate her needs, to create safe spaces in an often overwhelming world. Where other siblings might compete or clash, Zoe and Chloe had developed a partnership based on unconditional understanding and fierce mutual loyalty. From early childhood, Zoe had understood that her twin experienced reality differently, and rather than seeing this as strange or problematic, she had embraced it as part of what made Chloe special. She had learned to recognize the early signs of sensory overload, the way Chloe's speech patterns would change, the subtle shifts in her posture, the particular look that crossed her face when the world was becoming too much. The decision to apply for Family Feud had been controversial within the family. Chloe's parents had worried about the lights, the noise, the unpredictability of a television taping. But Chloe had been fascinated by the show's patterns and rhythms, and she had specifically requested to participate. With careful preparation and detailed planning, they had decided to give it a try. The preparation had been extensive. They had visited the studio during a non-taping day so Chloe could familiarize herself with the environment. They had practiced potential questions at home. Chloe had chosen her outfit carefully, selecting clothes with comfortable textures and bringing backup sensory tools in case she needed them. The morning of the taping had gone well. Chloe had worn her noise-canceling headphones during the drive to the studio. She had brought her weighted blanket and her favorite sensory toys. The production team had been briefed about her needs and had made accommodations where possible. During rehearsals, Chloe had been calm and engaged, providing thoughtful answers and even smiling at Steve's jokes. But live television was different from rehearsal. The audience was larger, louder, more energetic. The lights were brighter for the cameras. The whole atmosphere was more intense, more unpredictable. The energy of 300 people, all focused on the stage, created an invisible pressure that Chloe could feel in her body, even when she couldn't articulate it in words. By the third round of the game, Chloe's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack under the sensory assault. Zoe had noticed her sister's increasing signs of distress but had hoped they could make it through the full taping. She had been positioned to intervene if necessary, but had wanted to give Chloe every opportunity to succeed on her own terms. The question that had triggered everything was innocuous enough. Name something that might be too loud. It was Chloe's turn at the buzzer, and Steve had approached with his usual enthusiasm, ready to engage with one of the youngest contestants he had ever had on the show. "All right, Chloe," Steve had said, his voice carrying its familiar warmth but also the professional projection required for television. "Something that might be too loud. What do you think?" Chloe had looked at Steve, then at the blazing studio lights, then at the audience that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness beyond the stage. Her face had begun to contort with distress as every sound in the studio, the audience's murmurs, the electronic hum of equipment, the rustling of papers, even Steve's breathing, seemed to amplify and crash together in her ears like a cacophony of chaos. "Everything," Chloe had whispered, her voice barely audible over the microphones. "Everything is too loud. Everything is too bright. Everything is too much." And then the meltdown had begun. Chloe's hands had flown to her ears, pressing so hard that it looked painful. Her body had begun to rock back and forth in a repetitive motion that served as self-regulation when her nervous system was overwhelmed. Small sounds of distress had started escaping from her throat, not cries or sobs, but the involuntary vocalizations that sometimes accompanied sensory overload. The studio audience had fallen silent, unsure of what they were witnessing. Some people had leaned forward with concern, others had looked confused, and a few had begun to whisper among themselves. The cameras had kept rolling, but everyone involved in the production had sensed that something unprecedented was happening on their stage. Zoe had immediately stepped away from her position at the family podium and moved to her sister's side. She had positioned herself between Chloe and the audience, creating a human barrier that provided some visual protection from the overwhelming stimuli. "She's having sensory overload," Zoe had explained to Steve, her voice calm but urgent. "She has autism, and sometimes when there's too much input, her brain can't process it all. She needs the environment to be calmer. She needs less light, less sound, less stimulation." Steve Harvey had looked at Zoe, then at Chloe, who was now curled in on herself and making increasingly distressed sounds. In that moment, Steve had faced a choice that would define not just that episode but his understanding of what it meant to create inclusive spaces for people with different needs. Steve had set down his cards and turned to address his production team. "Cut the music," he had called out, his voice carrying across the studio with absolute authority. "Dim the lights. I need this studio to be as quiet and calm as possible right now." The theme music had stopped immediately. The blazing studio lights had been dimmed to a soft, ambient glow. Even the audience had instinctively lowered their voices to whispers, sensing that they were part of creating a healing environment for a child in distress. Steve had approached Chloe slowly and deliberately, making sure his movements were predictable and non-threatening. When he spoke, his voice was soft, gentle, stripped of all performance energy. "Chloe," he had said quietly, "my name is Steve. Can you hear me?" Chloe had nodded slightly, though her hands remained pressed against her ears, and her eyes were still squeezed shut against the world. "I'm going to help make this better," Steve had continued. "Zoe is going to help me understand what you need. We're going to take care of you." Steve had turned to Zoe, recognizing her as the expert on her sister's needs. "What else can we do?" he had asked. "What would help her feel safer?" "She needs deep pressure," Zoe had said, "like a really tight hug. And she needs to know that the overwhelming stuff is going to stop. She needs to know she's safe." Without hesitation, Steve Harvey had knelt down on the studio floor and opened his arms in invitation. Zoe had gently guided Chloe toward him, and Steve had wrapped both girls in the kind of firm, enveloping hug that provided the deep pressure input that many people with autism find calming. "You're safe," Steve had whispered to Chloe. "The lights are dim. The noise is gone. You're surrounded by people who care about you. You don't have to be overwhelmed anymore." Slowly, gradually, Chloe's breathing had begun to slow. Her body had stopped rocking. The distressed sounds had quieted. After several minutes of Steve simply holding both girls in the dimmed studio, Chloe had finally opened her eyes and looked around. "Better," she had said softly, the first word she had spoken since her meltdown began. Steve had smiled, not his television smile, but something genuine and warm and protective. "Better," he had agreed. "Now I want to tell you something, Chloe. What just happened doesn't make you broken or different in a bad way. It makes you someone who experiences the world more intensely than most people. And that's actually pretty amazing." Steve had stood up slowly, keeping one hand on each girl's shoulder. "Zoe," he had said, "I want to talk about you too. What you just did, taking care of your sister, knowing exactly what she needed, helping all of us understand how to help her, that's not just being a good sister, that's being a hero." Steve had addressed the studio audience, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just learned something important. "Ladies and gentlemen," he had announced, "these two young ladies have just taught us all something valuable about love, acceptance, and taking care of each other. Chloe experiences the world differently because she has autism. That doesn't make her less than anyone else. It makes her uniquely herself. And Zoe has shown us what it looks like to love someone exactly as they are." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping. But instead of giving it to one person, he had draped it across both girls' shoulders, creating a shared symbol of protection and acceptance. "This jacket represents something special," Steve had said. "It represents the idea that everyone deserves to feel safe, everyone deserves to be understood, and everyone deserves to have people who will change the environment to meet their needs instead of expecting them to change to meet the environment." Chloe had touched the jacket with wonder, then looked directly at Steve for the first time since her meltdown. "Thank you for making it quiet," she had said simply. "Thank you for teaching me something important," Steve had replied. "Can I ask you a question? Now that the lights are dim and it's quiet, how do you feel?" "Safe," Chloe had said, "and understood." "And Zoe," Steve had continued, "how does it feel to have a sister who knows exactly how to take care of you?" "Like I'm never alone," Zoe had answered without hesitation. Steve had turned back to the audience, and when he spoke, his voice carried the conviction of someone who had just witnessed something profound. "This is what inclusion looks like," he had said. "This is what happens when we adjust the world to fit people instead of expecting people to adjust to fit the world. These girls didn't need to change. The environment needed to change. And look what happened when it did." The game had continued in the dimmed lighting, with the audience maintaining their respectful quiet. Chloe had participated in 2 more questions, providing answers that were thoughtful and accurate. When Steve had asked about things that make you feel peaceful, Chloe had said, "When people understand that different doesn't mean wrong." When he had asked about things that make you strong, Zoe had answered, "Having someone who needs you to be strong for them." By the end of the episode, both girls had become the stars of the show without trying, without performing, simply by being authentically themselves and allowing others to witness what unconditional sibling love looked like. The audience had given them a standing ovation that was unlike any other in Family Feud history, not loud and boisterous but soft and sustained, a gentle expression of respect and admiration that honored Chloe's sensory needs while still celebrating both girls' courage and authenticity. The episode had aired 2 months later and had become one of the most shared and discussed Family Feud episodes in the show's history. Autism advocacy groups had praised it for its authentic representation of sensory processing differences. Educators had used it as a teaching tool about inclusion and accommodation. Most importantly, families affected by autism had felt seen and validated by mainstream media in a way that rarely happened. Chloe had kept the jacket that Steve had shared with her and Zoe, but more importantly, she had kept the confidence that came from being accepted exactly as she was. The experience had taught her that the right people would make accommodations for her needs, rather than expecting her to endure environments that caused her distress. Zoe had learned that her role as her sister's advocate and interpreter was not just valuable but essential, that the love and understanding she provided made a real difference in her sister's ability to navigate the world successfully. Steve Harvey had gained a deeper understanding of autism, sensory processing differences, and the importance of creating inclusive environments for people with disabilities. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is change the environment rather than expecting the person to change. The dimmed lights and quiet atmosphere had become a permanent option for the Family Feud production team when working with contestants who had sensory processing needs. Steve's response to Chloe's meltdown had set a new standard for how television shows could accommodate people with different neurological needs. The jacket that Steve had shared with both girls became a symbol of inclusion in their family, a reminder that the best relationships are those where people adjust their behavior to meet each other's needs rather than demanding that everyone conform to the same expectations. Years later, Chloe would become an advocate for autism awareness and sensory-friendly environments. Zoe would pursue a career in special education, inspired by her lifelong experience of seeing the world through her sister's eyes and advocating for her needs. Steve Harvey would say that Chloe and Zoe taught him one of the most important lessons of his career, that love doesn't mean treating everyone the same way. It means giving everyone what they specifically need to feel safe, valued, and understood. Because that's what acceptance looks like when it gets practical. That's what inclusion sounds like when it becomes action. And that's what happens when the perfect storm of overwhelming stimuli meets the perfect response of human understanding, environmental accommodation, and unconditional sibling love. The twins had shown an entire studio audience that different doesn't mean less than, that accommodating someone's needs is an act of love, and that the most beautiful relationships are those where people instinctively know how to take care of each other, even when the world becomes too much to handle.